Hello, everybody. If you're joining us, yes, welcome. We'll get started officially in about another 50 to 60 seconds. We'll just let people enter the room. Hi, everybody. Well, just waiting for people to log on and enter the room, and then we'll get started. Right, I think we're ready to go. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Canadian International Council Victoria Branch event, and welcome to our members and the guests that are joining us today. And we're happy to have you here, and welcome to our guest speaker today, Larry from Washington. My name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria on Vancouver Island. Before we do get underway officially, it's important to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples on whose territories we are meeting today. We are grateful to live here, and we honor the nations who have always and continue to care for these lands and waters. For those that aren't familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in a changing international landscape. And I think what makes us different from many think tanks is that, yes, we do have a national headquarters in Toronto, but we also have 18 branches across the country in many of the major cities with some 1,400 members who are all interested about where this country is going and what kind of role can we play in the world in the future. If you want to know more about the Canadian International Council, it's really easy. You just Google us and you'll find us. And we also have a webpage for our Victoria branch. And I will put my email address into the chat area if you want to contact me directly to learn more about us, because we are always on the lookout for new members, and we would certainly love to have you join our organization. Now, how today is going to work is that I will eventually stop talking and I will hand things over to Larry. Larry will speak for roughly 25 to 30 minutes about his book, The Kennedys in the World. And you can see I have a couple of copies positioned over my shoulder. And then we'll head to Q&A. And for the Q&A, all you need to do is look down to the bottom of the screen. You'll see a Q&A area where you can type your questions in, and then we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we possibly can. We're also recording this event. And I will say those 3 copies that I have over my shoulder, when we're finished today, we'll be randomly selecting 3 of our CIC Victoria members who are here today watching the event, and each of them will receive a copy of Larry's book. So when Larry's book does show up in the mail, do not be surprised, because you are one of the lucky winners. And I should say that we had tried to have Larry come up here and talk to us in person, but COVID put an end to those sorts of plans. And so here we are today. And now let me turn my attention to Larry. Larry is a former senior White House official and an award-winning journalist. He is also a senior fellow for US foreign policy at the American Foreign Policy Council, and he writes widely on foreign affairs. He's often quoted in newspapers and magazines and appears frequently on TV and radio. Now, at the White House, he was the communications director for Vice President Al Gore, and before that, for the Office of Management and Budget. Larry has also authored 6 books, including Harry and Arthur, Truman, Vandenberg, and the Partnership That Created the Free World. And many of you may recall that Larry and Jeremy Kinsman spoke at a CIC Victoria event just after the US election last November. And here we are already in March. And of course, Larry and Jeremy frequently appear on CTV with commentary about world affairs. And I'm sure many of you in the audience watch that. Now, today, the focus is on Larry's new book, The Kennedys in the World, and how Jack, Bobby, and Ted remade America's empire. And Larry, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We're looking forward to what you have to say about the book, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and CIC for having me. And of course, Chris, since you revealed this to me, happy birthday tomorrow, I understand. Thank you all for joining today. I'm looking forward very much to this talk and to the discussion afterward. I'll speak a bit about why I wrote the book. I'll obviously tell you quite a bit about what's in the book, and then I look forward to interacting with all of you. The book, by the way, which I know that you already saw over Chris's shoulder, I'll just point out that the picture at the bottom of the book, Jack, Bobby, and Ted in the middle, this is from 1962. So Jack was president, Bobby was the attorney general, and Ted that year ran for the first time successfully for the Senate, where he served for more than 4 decades. Let me begin with a broad and perhaps obvious observation, which is that we know a lot about Jack, Bobby, and Ted Kennedy from books, movies, and if we're old enough, like I am, our memories. We know about their successes, their failures, their struggles, and their scandals. We can see their faces, hear their voices, and recall their landmark moments. And yet, we continue to learn more about them. Just as we learn more about other iconic figures of America's past, no matter how many historians have made them the subject of their work. So just as we've seen big new biographies of each of the Kennedy brothers in recent years, we've seen a parade of new books about Lincoln and FDR and our founding fathers. So the search for our history continues, and we always have more to learn. For the Kennedy brothers in particular, the opening of more records and the reflections of more colleagues bring fresh perspectives about them. So from my reading of them, from fresh new records about them, and from my firsthand observations of Ted as I worked as a journalist in Washington, I came to discover an untold story about the brothers. Everybody knows that Joe Kennedy, a ruthless and demanding father, and Rose Kennedy, a cold and distant mother, groomed their sons for success. As Joe Kennedy told a friend on the golf course, "My work is my boys." Joe and Rose started with their first son, Joe Jr., who died tragically in a dangerous bombing mission over Germany in 1944 at the age of 29, and continued through Jack, Bobby, and Ted. But there's another angle of this story that almost no one knows, which is that from the time the brothers were little boys, Joe and Rose pushed them not just to succeed, but to look abroad, to look beyond America's borders, to learn about the world, to care about the world, and once they attained power, to shape America's role in the world. And over time, the brothers developed a deep understanding of the world's different peoples and cultures and ideologies, a keen appreciation for the challenges that they presented for the United States, and a strong desire to shape America's response to them. Once the brothers assumed power, they each applied what they learned from their education about the world and their travels to put a distinct mark on America's empire. For more than 6 straight decades, one or more of the brothers held public office. Jack was elected to the House in 1946, to the Senate in 1952, and to the presidency in 1960. Bobby served as a Senate staffer in the 1950s, and then as Attorney General and Jack's closest advisor when Jack was president. And he then went on to be elected to the Senate in 64 and served there until his death in 1968. Ted, as I mentioned earlier, was elected to the Senate in 1962 and served there all the way until his death in 2009. And during their time in office, Jack, Bobby, and Ted shaped not only broad issues of war and peace, but America's response to almost every major global challenge of their time: the Soviet Union and China, the Cold War in Cuba, the Dominican Republic and Chile, Nicaragua and El Salvador, Korea and Vietnam, South Africa and Northern Ireland, and Iraq twice. And because they shaped the global role of the world's greatest power, they changed the world itself in profound ways. That's the rich, new, fascinating, and consequential story that I tell in this book. And the story began in the earliest days of Jack, Bobby, and Ted. Joe and Rose led discussions about the world with the boys over breakfast and dinner. Joe invited prominent people like Charles Lindbergh and Henry Luce to dine with them to enrich the conversations. Joe wrote to the boys about global events when he or they were away. Joe sent the boys to travel overseas when they were old enough. He arranged meetings for them with the world's leading figures, and Joe secured jobs for each of them as foreign correspondents when they were overseas, so they could position themselves as global thinkers to audiences back home. All three brothers traveled widely, sometimes with one another, but more often with friends, colleagues, and mentors. And when they traveled to learn, not to lie on the beach. They met with kings and czars, prime ministers and diplomats. They visited war zones and discussed conflicts with military chiefs. They walked the streets, talked to everyday people, and observed everyday life. And they developed insights into leaders and peoples and cultures and ideologies that they later put to good use. They were all exceptionally gifted, self-confident writers. Their private notes and articles and other writings were rich in color and insight. So, if I may, let me give you a few examples. In the summer of 1945, Jack was a 28-year-old journalist with Hearst newspapers. Hearst sent him to Germany to cover the Potsdam Conference, where Harry Truman and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin would discuss the post-war world. On his way to Potsdam, where he traveled with Navy Secretary James Forrestal, who you may know later became our defense secretary, he stopped in Berlin to look at the war damage. In the diary of his trip, he wrote, "The devastation is complete. There is not a single building which is not gutted. On some of the streets, the stench, sweet and sickish from dead bodies, is overwhelming. The people all have completely colorless faces, a yellow tinge with pale tan lips. They are all carrying bundles. Where they are going, no one seems to know. I wonder whether they do. They sleep in cellars. The women will do anything for food." 3 years later, in the spring of 1948, Bobby Kennedy was a 22-year-old journalist with the Boston Post. He was on a 6-month trip across Europe and the Middle East, which his father sent him on to learn more about the world. He spent time in what was then known as Palestine, from where he would write 4 front-page stories for the Boston Post. This was 2 months before the State of Israel was created, but already it was clear that Jews and Arabs on that land were headed for war. In the third of his 4 stories, Bobby wrote, "The Jews who have been lucky enough to get to Palestine are hardy and tough. They can go into the Mediterranean Sea and get drowned, or they can stay and fight and perhaps get killed. They will fight, and they will fight with unparalleled courage. This is their greatest and last chance. The eyes of the world are upon them, and there can be no turning back." 8 years after that, in the summer of 1956, Ted Kennedy was a 24-year-old journalist with the International News Service. He had wanted to see the world, and when he asked Jack where he should go, Jack suggested Africa, where colonial populations were revolting against their Western rulers and creating new governments. From there, Ted wrote for the International News Service, and in one of his pieces, tried to assess the future. He wrote, "Changes, long pent up, are erupting everywhere and moving with incredible speed, and inchoate leadership is still trying to find its footing. and the perspectives of a future foreign policy from Morocco are still wavering and sensitive to foreign negotiations. Finally, a future of Morocco will be determined to a large degree by what happens in the next few months in Algeria and what kind of policy the United States can offer Africa by the start of the new year. Now, everybody knows the basics about the Kennedy family. The brothers grew up in privilege, they were driven to win, and they were challenged to measure up to one another. But what fewer people know is that the Kennedys were also what these days we might call dysfunctional, and it affected the brothers in big ways. Joe Kennedy set very high standards for the boys. He lashed out at them when they fell short, and he pitted one against the other. Not surprisingly, through early adulthood, each brother battled deep insecurities about winning his respect. Joe urged his sons to stick together, and they did when they were adults. But when they were children, relations between them were often rocky. Joe Jr. felt threatened by Jack, and he bullied and beat him regularly and badly. Jack told the psychiatrist that he agonized about measuring up to his older brother, who was considered the shining star of the family. And Jack, who was carefree and fun, did not much enjoy the company of Bobby, who was dark and dour. After growing up in the same house, raised by the same mother and father, we shouldn't be surprised that they shared certain traits as adults. They were fierce whenever they competed, tireless in whatever they pursued, demanding on those around them, brave to the point of recklessness, and presumptuous to the point of audacity. But they were not carbon copies of one another. Their personalities and their outlook on America's role in the world were shaped by a host of factors. Jack, who was born on May 29th, 1917 in the family house in Brookline, Massachusetts, was a man of charm and wit, depth and insight, energy and action. He was fun-loving, irreverent, and mischievous. He had a restless mind and a captivating personality, which made him the center of any discussion that he was in. When he was not having a stimulating conversation, he was inventing brain-teasing games just for fun. He was often bemused, he mocked himself as much as others, and he had a sharp eye for irony. Because he was so inquisitive and his interests ranged so widely, life with him was never boring. A friend said that his personality was sparkling, and that the time you spent with him seemed like you were at a fair. Interestingly, his sparkling personality emerged from some very difficult circumstances. For one thing, Jack was bitter about the way his mother had raised him. As a young boy, he cried when she went on one of her frequent trips, including trips to Europe to shop for clothes. She never visited him during his 5 teenage years at Choate, the private boarding school, even though it was only 65 miles from home, and even when he spent weeks in the infirmary during one of his many illnesses. As an adult, he told a friend that his mother, as he put it, never hugged me. Never, never. For another thing, as I've mentioned, Joe Jr. bullied and beat him. Joe Jr. used to crash his bicycle into Jack's, and he once sent him to the hospital for 28 stitches. He smashed footballs into his stomach, and at night, he picked fights with Jack that left the two of them throwing one another against the walls in their house. And for still another thing, Jack had a wreck of a body. He had scarlet fever when he was 2, and Addison's disease and serious back problems throughout his life that left him in constant pain. As a House member, he leaned on his colleagues as he walked from his office to the House chamber. As a senator, he sometimes spent the entire day in the Senate chamber to avoid the walk back and forth to his office, and his staff canceled his meetings and brought his paperwork to him. And as a House member, senator, and president, he often used crutches that he hid from the public. For Jack, life was a daily struggle, a constant chore. All of these struggles shaped his outlook on foreign affairs. Jack was the quintessential Cold Warrior, and he fully embraced the Cold War consensus of his time. that America's top global challenge must be to contain Soviet communism. But beyond that, he seemed to project his own struggles onto his country. For him, the question was whether to gain public office, he could find the strength with an aching back and an ailing stomach to walk streets, climb stairs, shake hands, and deliver speeches from early in the morning until late at night. For his country, similarly, the question was whether it could find the strength, the will, the fortitude to protect itself, to confront its aggressive adversaries. To Jack, whether the year was 1947 or 1963, the challenge was in Europe or Asia, or the issue was military or diplomatic, the nation was always, as he put it, at a moment of maximum peril, facing great danger, confronting our most critical challenge. He warned that time is running out, that we were confronting a peril more deadly than any wartime danger we have ever known. He fretted over the tide of events that were always moving toward the Soviets, the coming communist onslaught, the major disaster that was just around the corner, the seemingly hopeless predicament, the sense of paralysis, waning of hope, sense of drift, and gnawing dissatisfaction that was afflicting us, and the threats to the peace and security of the world, if not the very continued existence of mankind. Bobby Kennedy was 8 years younger than Jack, and he had his own demons to confront. Bobby, who was born on November 20th, 1925 in Brookline, Massachusetts, was a classic middle child. He was starved for attention, as his father poured his hopes into Joe Jr. and Jack, and the family doted on the younger Ted. His father labeled him a runt, and he often seemed like one, especially when standing next to his older, taller, smoother, more handsome brothers. Jack called him Black Robert because he often looked dour and sad. He stood with his hands in his pocket and his head buried in his neck. When Bobby was 20, one of Jack's friends said of him, words came out of his mouth as if each one spoken depleted an already severely limited supply. Even when Bobby was an accomplished adult, his hands sometimes shook when he delivered an important speech. And as an adult, he once told a friend, sometimes I wish I was never born. To prove himself, he pursued reckless challenges throughout his life. When he was just 3, he jumped into Nantucket Sound while he was sailing with his siblings, even though he didn't know how to swim, which forced Joe Jr. to rescue him. At Harvard, he played football on a broken leg against Yale so he could earn his school letter. As an adult, he swam in dangerous waters, skied dangerous slopes, and climbed dangerous mountains. Overseas, he waded into hostile crowds even when his security details couldn't guarantee his safety, and he was sometimes spat on or hit by eggs and tomatoes. And he inspected dangerous mines to survey working conditions. He praised bravery and courage and guts, and he openly disparaged people for their cowardice. So not surprisingly, he brought an aggressive, sometimes reckless approach to foreign policy when Jack was president. He also brought a strong sense of morality, and that's because, like his mother, Bobby was a deeply devout Catholic. He was an altar boy, he regularly attended Mass, and he married Ethel Skakel, who was even more devout than he was. Unlike Jack, who was cool and cerebral, Bobby was passionate. And also unlike Jack, who accepted the world's imperfections and shaped his policies accordingly, Bobby viewed foreign policy like he viewed everything else, in terms of black and white, good and evil. And when he changed his mind, he was just as passionate about his new views as he had been about his old ones. Ted Kennedy also was passionate, but he was far less a man swept by passion than Bobby. Ted also was smart, but he was far less of a deep thinker than Jack. But among the three brothers, he was by far the best politician. Ted, who was born on February 22nd, 1932 in Boston, was cute and chubby as a child. He was often lonely as he was shuffled among 10 different schools. When he came home for a weekend, the house was often largely empty, with his father away for work, his mother on one of her frequent trips, Joe Jr. and Jack at Harvard or War, and his other siblings at different boarding schools. His parents and siblings often talked about his weight, which must have proved painful. His siblings called him biscuits and muffins and fat stuff, and in letters among family members, when Ted was 8, they often called him fat or fatter than ever. But he must have received enough love from his parents because, unlike Jack, he did not harbor any resentment. Even though he was the baby of the family, he still needed to earn his stripes, just like his older brothers. When he was 6, Joe Jr. threw him into Nantucket Sound when he failed to carry out a sailing command. When he was 7, his siblings pressured him into jumping off a rock on the Riviera that was at least 20 feet above the water. When he was 28 and campaigning for Jack across the West, when Jack ran for president, he ski jumped from 180 feet, even though he had never done anything like it before, and he rode a tough bronco at a rodeo before the horse threw him to the ground. As a child, Ted was rooted and self-confident, and as he moved from school to school, he learned how to make friends quickly. In those early years, he spent lots of time with his maternal grandfather, Rose's father, the former Boston mayor known as Honey Fitz. They would meet in his office in Boston, or have lunch in the dining room of his hotel, or walk the streets of the city. And Ted watched as Honey Fitz shook hands and traded stories and offered condolences. So when Ted became a senator at just 30, the minimum age, he already knew how to stroke egos and slap backs and trade favors. That was everything that Jack and Bobby hated to do as senators. Ted viewed the Senate not necessarily the way Jack and Bobby did, as just a step on the ladder to higher office, but instead as a great place to do fulfilling work over the long term. He deferred to his political elders, and he learned the Senate's Byzantine rules so he can turn ideas into laws. So, how did the brothers remake America's empire? For starters, as they grew from boys to men, all three brothers discarded the isolationism that their father promoted throughout his life. From their travels abroad, the travels that, ironically, their isolationist father sent them on, they came to believe that America must play a prominent role on the world stage and that it can serve as a beacon for other nations to emulate. The brothers all feared war, favored diplomacy, promoted human rights, and worked to control the world's deadliest weapons. Through Jack's death in 1963, they were all Cold Warriors. But with what he learned from his travels and his voracious reading, Jack pushed America's Cold War strategy in a starkly new direction. He believed the Cold War would be won not in Europe, but in the developing world, where hundreds of millions of people were deciding between freedom and loyalty to the United States or communism and loyalty to the Soviet Union. Rather than support right-wing dictators and colonial governments, he wanted America to build relations with grassroots populations because he thought that was a better way to compete with the Soviets and the Chinese over the long term. As a senator, he ruffled feathers in Washington and in Europe by urging the Europeans to free their colonies. As president, he created the Alliance for Progress for Latin America and the Peace Corps for the world. He showered more foreign aid on the new nations of Africa, and he met with their leaders. Jack's desire to improve America's image across the developing world also drove his support for the civil rights movement at home. because America's race problems were making nations of color hesitant to develop strong ties to the United States. After learning valuable lessons from the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Jack peacefully resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, secured a limited test ban treaty with the Soviets, and laid the groundwork for more arms control, which he had hoped to pursue. He came to doubt his early decision to make a stand against communism in Vietnam, and he sent strong signals that he would withdraw after he presumably won re-election in 1964. Shortly before his death, he was also rethinking his hardline policies toward China and Cuba. Up until then, Bobby and Ted were also hardcore Cold Warriors. In the 1950s, Bobby worked on foreign policy for the notorious Senator Joe McCarthy, who was a close family friend. He traveled across the Soviet Union with Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, another family friend, and returned to criticize Moscow in speeches and interviews and writings over its human rights abuses and economic backwardness. Also in the 1950s, Ted toured Europe with a friend and traveled across Africa with one of his Harvard instructors. In the early 1960s, he returned to Africa and then traveled across Latin America and Europe before winning his Senate seat in 1962 as a Cold War hawk. But after Jack died, Lyndon Johnson took over and the world changed. Bobby and Ted changed with it. They evolved from Cold War hawks into leading liberal doves and drove America's foreign policy in starkly new directions. Bobby in particular emerged from months of trauma after Jack's death as very much a new man. While Jack became a more seasoned leader over the years, Bobby became more of a revolutionary as he traveled the world and saw the terrible conditions in which people lived and worked. Bobby changed not just because Jack was gone and he could be himself, but because the world changed. The more that Vietnam, which began as a Cold War venture for Jack, turned into a horror show, the more that Bobby questioned the venture, his early support for it, and its relationship to the Cold War. He was no less a critic of communism, but he now viewed Vietnam as a much bigger problem for America than the Cold War. He had been a Cold Warrior, but after Jack died, he played a larger role than anyone else in destroying America's Cold War consensus. And that left the world more unsettled, and it left America more divided over its global role. Like Bobby, Ted also had been a Cold Warrior, and also like Bobby, he broke with LBJ over Vietnam. Both Bobby and Ted pushed for more arms control, promoted human rights across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and set the stage for the opening to China that Nixon and Carter later pursued. But unlike Bobby, Ted knew how to get things done in Congress. To an uncommon degree, he knew how to work the system, build coalitions, and achieve results on foreign policy. And that was true even when he was opposed by the president, who is always the country's most powerful figure on foreign policy. He spearheaded the successful efforts to impose sanctions on South Africa over apartheid. That was in a congressional override of President Reagan's veto, the first override of a president on foreign policy in 11 years, spearheaded by Ted. He also spearheaded the successful efforts to end proxy wars with the Soviets in Latin America and make peace in Northern Ireland. And in his low-key, behind-the-scenes efforts that have not received nearly the attention they deserved, he convinced Soviet and Chinese leaders to free dozens and dozens of political prisoners. In fact, through his 46 years in the Senate, he had a greater long-term impact on remaking America's empire than either Jack or Bobby. And with that, I'll thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions, and I'll turn things back over to Chris.
Well, Larry, thank you very much. And one of the challenges with Zoom is you can't hear a room of people applauding at this point, so let me do that. That was a grand tour de force. I have to fully disclose that I had a chance to read this book even before it came out, and I have written a review on Amazon.ca, and I really love the book. I love the book because of the personal side, the family side of the family, not just the political side. And so we'll move on to some questions. And a reminder for folks, if you do have any questions for Larry, we do have the Q&A area at the bottom. You can type your questions right there, and I will take a look, and we will get them on the floor. But in the meantime, I have a couple of questions, because what struck me as I read your book were the parallels to today in many respects. And I'll give you some examples. You wrote about Joe Kennedy, and he called, in a speech that he gave in 1951, he called on the US to withdraw from South Korea and essentially abandon Europe. Right. And then in 1951, actually it was his speech in 1950, then a year later, Jack said the same thing, that Europe wasn't doing enough to look after its sort of own defenses. And we see that argument today with NATO. Later on in the book, you talk about their view of China being relentlessly expansionist. Right. So here we are, we're talking about events in the 50s and the 60s. They sound very similar to events today. And it makes me ask you the question, why did you choose to write this book at this time? Because you had an interest in the Kennedy family, or was it because you saw events similar today with the Trump administration? What was the motivation behind you sitting down to write this book about the Kennedy family?
So I think I wrote this book for a variety of reasons. I will tell you that it was not motivated by the isolationism that we saw under Trump. Having said that, we have seen in this country creeping levels of isolationist sentiment, both in Washington as well as around the country, something that has concerned me. And that was one reason that I wrote both this book and the previous book being Harry and Arthur, about how Truman and Vandenberg created the architecture of the free world in the 1940s, and this being a much broader look through the experience of the Kennedys as at America's post-war role over the course of more than 60 years. So let me continue with this for a minute. Presidents need to remind the American people what is at stake with regard to our role around the world, because there is always a level of opposition due to cost. That's where you get the constant debate about, are the allies doing their fair share? Should we be paying as much as we're paying for the United Nations? What are the Japanese and the South Koreans doing to protect themselves from China and North Korea? And you see it in a whole variety of, other regions. We've seen it in recent decades with regard to our interest in the Middle East, where many Americans have said, why are we protecting the Saudis? Why do we care that much about Israel? And so on. And American presidents need to make the case that the reason that America leads the free world, the reason that we try to promote freedom and democracy and do it through a variety of different channels while we protect our interests, is the fact that a freer, more democratic world is a safer, more prosperous world, both for the world and for the United States. And the fact is that there is no one else who is going to come in and fill the void. We came in 1947 and filled the void when the British announced, in essence, that they were too tired, too exhausted, and too broke to continue to play their traditional role, which had stretched from the 19th century halfway through the 20th century. We stepped into the void. No one's waiting in the wings. No one has the capacity to do this. We need to do it. And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons we've seen creeping isolationism that is worrying in the United States is that our recent presidents have not made the case forcefully. President Obama was a little bit reluctant to promote freedom and democracy in a way that most of our presidents have been comfortable doing. And then, of course, we had the blatant isolationism and America firstism over, under President Trump, and that has only fed isolationist sentiments, which is, by the way, one of the reasons I've been so delighted by some of the early moves by President Biden to restore this role of promoting freedom and democracy. So that's one reason. Second reason is I did discover this new story about the Kennedys, and it was in the course of wanting to write this broader story about America's post-war role, and frankly, they just came together. I discovered this new story about the Kennedy brothers, all raised to look abroad, and the enormous influence that they had over the course of more than 6 decades. And finally, the story within the story. That is that we know that Jack Kennedy was very interested in foreign policy, and he was a hardcore Cold Warrior. And many know the story of Bobby being the Cold Warrior and then transitioning over Vietnam. Very few people know the enormous influence that Ted Kennedy had in foreign policy over the course of more than 40 years, more influential than his two brothers. So I think that combination of reasons is why I wanted to write this book as much as I did.
Yeah, that's one thing that struck me in the review that I wrote was the role that Ted Kennedy comes out as a hero, the hero, if you like, in the book. When you look at his long political career and his opposition, as you earlier, you outlined some of the things that he took on in sort of contravention very often to many of his colleagues about what America was doing in the world.
Yes.
I do have a question from our audience, from Michael, who does say that he's looking forward to buying your book. So
music we know, as you can imagine.
Well, now we know that we've sold 4 copies here in Canada, the 3 That's over right. my shoulder, and Michael will buy a copy.
That's just this, Chris. You have to remember not to give him one of the freebies because he already said he'd buy one.
That's exactly right. So there we go. That's I will keep that in mind. But Michael also asks, other than Americans themselves, and I think you've touched on this, other than Americans themselves, do you feel that many of us in the rest of the world still believe that America is the so-called leader of the free world? It appears to be a different world after 4 years of former President Trump.
Right.
So I guess the question is, and I think you have touched on this, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, because of course China is a rising power, but not to the level of the United States, certainly at this point. And the United States has such a huge presence. So how do you see America today?
Well, I think that I subscribe to something that Joe Biden, coincidentally, said during the campaign, which is 4 years of Donald Trump may prove to be an aberration. 8 years of Donald Trump would cause permanent damage. Now, both of those may be overstatements on the extremes, but I think the guts of it is right. That is, one term, President Trump, he was soundly defeated, whether he believes it or not. He was soundly defeated by Joe Biden. And Joe Biden is really, I think, quite intentionally reinforcing the traditional role of the United States around the world. That is to forcefully articulate about human rights. That is to take on the autocrats, to provide moral support for the dissidents, to work closely with our allies, whether they are in Europe or Asia, where, as you know, senior administration, foreign policy officials have been in recent days, or the Middle East or elsewhere. I think, as I said before, that there are certain good things that only the United States can do. There is no one waiting in the wings. There is clearly a need for some great power to promote freedom and democracy. And in fact, I would argue, Chris, that this need is particularly acute now because as you and others on this call may know, Freedom House, the nonprofit that tracks political rights and civil liberties, just reported that 2020 was the 15th straight year that freedom has declined around the world. And I would suggest to you that while we are not the cause totally of this, it is no coincidence that this began in the latter years of President George W. Bush, when his freedom agenda lost steam, through 8 years of Barack Obama and then 4 years of Donald Trump. There was this voice lacking out of Washington. We gave more running room for the autocrats. We provided less support for political dissidents, would-be Democrats, and all the rest. And, the autocrats are sort of on the rise. And China is promoting its authoritarian alternative to US-led freedom and democracy. We must step up at this critical time. I think Joe Biden is trying to do that. And yes, I think after 4 years of Donald Trump, to answer the question, yes, the United States still can, and I would suggest will, play this traditional role, and we will see competing voices, freedom on one side, authoritarianism on the other. And with that in mind, I just have to be hopeful about the future.
Yeah, I said to my wife yesterday, we would wake up here and turn on the news, and for sure, the first few minutes would be dedicated to what was coming out of the White House with President Trump. Right. And now it's only occasionally will we see something or other with President Biden. So it's quite remarkable how the United States has sort of dropped off the radar up here when it comes to sensational news, if you like. But as you say, yes, I mean, the Secretary of State was in South Korea yesterday, I think, and
yes, that's right.
Up in Alaska today, meeting with the Chinese. So right. Perhaps we are getting back on track. I have a question here from Jan Drent, who is interested to know a little bit more about why Joe Kennedy took an isolationist view during the pre-war period and during the war period and shortly after. Where did that come from?
Well, as you probably know, Joe Kennedy served as the U.S. ambassador to London in the late 1930s, 2 years before he wanted to leave, and President Roosevelt had had enough of him anyway. And when he was over there, and we saw this rise of the fascist powers in Europe through the 1930s, I think the isolationism was rooted in the fact that from his speeches and from the conversations he was having with his sons and from writings that he did, sometimes he would write pieces for newspapers and magazines, he, similar to Donald Trump, interestingly enough, did not see the vital importance of the difference between free and authoritarian countries. And he would often, suggest that this is a big world and we have to get along with people and it doesn't matter the nature of their government. And then he famously said in an interview that he thought was off the record in late 1940, democracy is finished in Britain. It may be here in the United States as well. I think the isolationism came from the fact that he didn't see what was at stake. And in fact, he thought that if Europe, he said at one point, he thought that if Europe went communist because of the Soviet Union in the beginnings of the Cold War, that it really didn't matter that much because the European people would see that communism was no bargain and they would throw off their communist governments. Obviously, from seeing the difference between free and communist states up close from their travels to Asia, the Middle East, to cross the Iron Curtain in the 1950s, Jack and Bobby, Africa, Ted. They saw all sorts of different models of governance They saw all sorts of hope on the ground and struggle on the ground. They saw what the Soviets and the Chinese were trying to promote and accomplish on the ground. And they saw the difference in a stark way between free and non-free countries that Joe Kennedy just didn't seem to get. And when you don't get the difference, you don't necessarily think that America has such a vital role to play around the world, because what's the difference between, whether a country far from home goes free or communist? The three Kennedy sons all understood what was at stake.
Mm. This ties now into a question from Don that we have here, and it's in relation to the spreading of democracy and the fact that the U.S. has shown to be, put its own interests at play. It has in the past when becoming involved in other countries, and perhaps doesn't have such an outstanding record on human rights.
Right.
And it does tie into your book, because I pulled a line from the book where it was Jack Kennedy who said early on that the United States was a goldfish bowl before the world. Yes. We have to practice what we preach. And of course, if we do look at situations like we've seen in the Dominican Republic and decades ago, Nicaragua, Vietnam, and then even more recently, is it a case of America, has the right intent, but sometimes it just doesn't go according to plan? Is it American self-interest, or is America really altruistic in these situations? I think it's a question that's what really Don is trying to ask, because America, yes. Yeah.
Well, it's obviously a fair question. So I'll do the best with it that I possibly can. And I think there are different answers to it. One answer is that while promoting freedom and democracy has been a core element of our post-World War II strategy for most of that period, okay, presidents have varied in terms of how high a priority it has been in their foreign policy. It was a very high priority for Jack Kennedy. It was a very high priority for, I would argue, Ronald Reagan, particularly in drawing distinctions with the Soviet Empire. It was a high priority for President Clinton as he traveled around the world. It was for a certain part of time, certainly through the first term, a high priority for President George W. Bush in the aftermath of 9/11, when he said, in essence, with the war on terror, freedom is now under attack. With other presidents like the realists of the 1970s, Nixon and Ford, the realism of the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, it was less of a priority. So that is certainly one answer. A second answer is promoting freedom and democracy is one element of American foreign policy, but we can't be naive about this. It is only one element. We do have global interests. We do have regional interests. And because we have competing interests, there are times when we have to collaborate with some, let's say, nefarious actors on the world stage because we have other things at stake. And that's a reality. And then the third reality is, tying to what I said at the beginning, to the extent that some of our presidents considered promoting freedom and democracy less important than other priorities, they have been more willing to cozy up to insidious powers. So, the 1970s, Nixon and Ford with right-wing dictators in Latin America. President Obama, I would argue, ignoring human rights abuses in Iran and cutting the 2015 global nuclear deal, cozying up to Erdogan in Turkey and trying to reset relations with the autocrat in Moscow, Vladimir Putin. So, I think this is on different levels. I think there's lots to criticize. And I would make one final point when it comes to promoting freedom and democracy. It's really hard. It's really hard. We have great successes. I would argue, partly for this reason, we won the Cold War. Certainly, we stepped in, used military force, and stopped genocide in the Balkans in 1990. We provided important moral support for peoples behind the Iron Curtain and in other parts of the world. But have we misstepped on occasion? Absolutely. Did we overstep in Vietnam? Of course. Did we maybe step too quickly after sending mixed signals in Korea? Certainly. Did we mismanage the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq after we toppled Saddam? Of course. So what can I say? It's a mixed record, but I come out on the side of thinking it is still important to do.
Mm-hmm. When we look at the United States today, there is a tendency on the part of some to say that America is in decline. But what struck me when I was reading your book is how difficult things have been for the United States in the past. Mm-hmm. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for sure, but Vietnam alone. Reading your book brought that all back. The sort of 500,000 American troops in Vietnam in 1968 alone. The millions of Vietnamese that were killed, of course, but over 50,000 US troops were killed. I mean, that's just one little slice, but America was incredibly bogged down. And even though the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan seem to go on, and they cost a huge amount of money, in many ways, it pales in comparison to those massive marches that you saw in the United States during the Vietnam period. So for those that are listening today, that was a great, what it really showed me that was how tough America has had it in the past. But I do have a question from the audience, from Rob Norris, and it's about, this is something that you didn't talk about in the book, and that's us, Canada. We know that our Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, had a very, very difficult relationship with Jack Kennedy. And if I recall, Knowlton Nash wrote a great book about this a few years ago. And do you think when you were doing your research, did anything come to the top of the pile when it came to Jack Kennedy and his two brothers, Ted, et cetera, with Canada, or were we just not on the radar when you were doing your research?
Well, I don't want to say you weren't on the radar, because I think Jack was cognizant of the importance of the relationship. And as far as I recall, I don't think I wrote much about it, but I, made an early visit. And in fact, on his early visit to Canada, hurt his back very badly. And as he was planting a tree and I think digging some dirt, and he was suffering quite a bit when he went to Vienna and met with Khrushchev in June. They understood the importance of the relationship, but I have to tell you that, in a sense, they also took the relationship for granted. I mean, here you are, you're a close ally, just like we took, he took the relationship, all the Kennedys did. And I'm not saying this in the pejorative. They were right to take the relationship for granted. I mean, we are close allies. We are close allies with the Europeans, and relations from time to time get rocky, but they don't challenge the bedrock relationship. In fact, I would argue with you that really the only time the relationship was really challenged at its core was in the last 4 years, with the hostility that came out of Washington under Trump. The U.S. relationship with Canada was challenged. The U.S. relationship with our traditional allies in Western Europe was challenged. But on the other hand, in line with what I have said about Biden on other fronts, I don't think it was a coincidence that Biden reached out to, Justin Trudeau early. They had their virtual summit very early. He's been on the phone with the Western Europeans, and, with concern from our traditional allies in Europe. I don't think it's any surprise that Secretary of State Blinken, Defense Secretary Austin were out in Asia this week, and not only to remind the Chinese that we consider ourselves an Asian power that is not going to get pushed out of the region, but to reassure our allies in Tokyo and Seoul, South Korea, that we're going to be there. So that's about the best I can do. I do not, as you know, Chris, I do not belabor the U.S.-Canadian relationship in the book. But certainly they took it seriously, but assumed it was there because we're core allies.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I know our hour is up. It's gone very, very quick. But I also know your Secretary of State is in Alaska. There are meetings going on with the Chinese. You briefly mentioned it. We've got the two Michaels, as you know,
Yes.
that are being held by the Chinese. What do you think is going to come out of what will be happening in Alaska? What will be the Americans telling the Chinese?
Well, I think the expectations that the United States are setting are pretty low. It's a lot of talking turkey about basic issues. Make clear where we stand on trade, on Chinese aggression in the region and beyond, on human rights in Hong Kong with the Muslim Uyghurs. And just as a general matter, crack down on the internet for the Chinese people and just, that autocratic power and the differences that we have with that. There's concern about the Chinese military buildup and at what point they might want to move against Taiwan, particularly because the leader of Taiwan is a bit bold on that side and talk of independence and all the rest. So we've got a lot of concerns. I think, though I hate to disappoint the audience, a Canadian audience, but I'd be surprised if this got tied in very heavily with the two Michaels and that we found a way to cut a deal that would free them. We've still got, our ongoing conflict over the Chinese company and what it might have done with regard to Iran sanctions. I think it's unlikely that's going to be resolved in this first meeting. This first meeting is a scene-setting meeting, and the White House is downplaying the likelihood of immediate follow-ups, and a real plan of a series of meetings to get to the issues. So we'll see. Maybe they're right to lowball expectations. As Winston Churchill said, jaw, meaning talking, jaw is better than war. So it is good that we're going to have these meetings. Hopefully they will put the US-China relationship on a more productive footing. Hopefully at some point we'll get to some resolution with our differences over the Chinese company, and which, the extradition hearings and all the rest that led to the taking of the two Michaels in the first place. Hopefully Biden at some point is going to talk turkey with Xi Jinping about the way the two Michaels are being treated. And hopefully we'll get some resolution, but it's not something that I can offer great hopes for in the immediate future, as much as I desperately want Beijing to free them, as much as I know you all do.
Mm-hmm. Well, Larry, thank you for that. I highly recommend your book to everybody. If you are in Victoria, Munro's books, they are prepped. If you are ready to go and purchase a copy, they have some on hand. And I'd just like to thank you on behalf of our audience today, our virtual audience, not only here in Victoria, but some in the United States and across Canada, because it was an excellent tour de force of the period. And it certainly helps put current events into context as well. So one reason, just one of many, to go and purchase the book. Larry, thank you again on behalf of us all. And for those of you that have joined us today, I saw Michael asking about where you could find more information about the Canadian International Council. I have put my email into the chat section. It's cakilford@gmail.com. And we are easily found by Googling the Canadian International Council. You'll find all about us there. And by all means, send me an email. I'd be glad to talk to you about our organization. And we do have some new events coming up shortly. Today was a bit of a historical event with ties to today, but we have Heidi Twork speaking next on news from Germany, the competition to control world communication from 1900 to 1945. And then moving more towards today, we have a panel on Syrian refugees with panelists from Istanbul and also from Canada talking about the situation for Syrian refugees who are still in Turkey. And of course, the 73,000 Syrian refugees that have been brought here to Canada and now call Canada home. So we'll be talking about that as well. So that's it for me. Thank you for joining us today. Larry, thank you again, and hope to see you at one of our next events.
Well, I hope
Take care, everybody. Larry, what did you say?
I would just suggest that if you do buy the book, you can return the favor by doing as Chris did, doing a review on Amazon.
Right. Yes, it's easy to do, and I certainly enjoyed doing that review.
Thanks, Chris.
Take care, Larry. Goodbye, everybody.